Invite. Mrs. Lam, I'm from Commercial Radio. Just now you mentioned many countries postponed the elections, and you mentioned the UK in particular. Well, actually, when the UK postponed the election, first it was from end March to May, but now they have several thousand confirmed cases every day and several hundred deaths every day. And Hong Kong is not that bad. If you look at South Korea or Tokyo, Singapore, they held elections during the epidemic. There's still another month or so before the election, so why won't you wait a bit longer to decide whether to proceed with the election? Now you're rushing to postpone the election, so is it, as some has suggested, is a political consideration? You're worried about the prospects of the pro-establishment camp. Another question is that for some from the Democratic camps, they've been disqualified as candidates, and some are actually incumbent Legislative Council members. Now they've been disqualified as candidates, and then if we have some sort of a provisional Legislative Council, and then can they still remain a member of the council? Thank you for your two questions. Firstly, is the epidemic in a dire situation here in Hong Kong? Well, you ask anyone in Hong Kong, I think they would say so. Now, we've taken various measures, in particular in relation to social distancing measures. We have already reached the stage of the toughest measures. And then in terms of reducing arrivals and departures, well, there's no more room to do it further. We do not know yet if the epidemic is peaking. And now we are seeing great risk of the epidemic spreading further because there are still many silent carriers in the community. So that's why we keep appealing to the public, try to stay home as far as possible and try to work from home as far as possible. So the epidemic is indeed severe in Hong Kong. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Well, if you compare our situation to that in other countries, it's not a direct comparison. It depends on the situation in a country. You know, the healthcare system there, the strategies adopted in fighting the virus and so on. But for us, the strategy we adopt is that for all confirmed cases, they are to be sent to hospital for treatment and isolation, and that includes those with relatively mild symptoms. You know, in some countries they don't do that. They allow patients mild symptoms. They make patients mild symptoms to stay at home. To stay at home. But then in Hong Kong, if we do this now, the hospital system is already overwhelmed. We need to find other facilities, say at Lei Ying Wun Holiday Camp and Asia World Expo and so on. I don't think I need to, give you further details about the dire situation in Hong Kong. Now, you said you compare our situation to the UK. Now, on the 19th of March, the emergency bill was tabled at the House of Commons, and then it was passed on the 25th of March. And it was 47 days from the May election, and now we are 33 days from the September election. So so in other words, we are trying to wait as long as we could to see whether the epidemic could be brought under control. But I mean, with risk to stay, we still remain undecided, or as some have said, if we don't take this, we're not decisive, then it will lead to certain more uncertainties. And because, as I've said, now that the nomination period has come to an end, and candidates will start the electioneering activity. So what we're doing now is being responsible. Then you mentioned there are places that proceeded with the elections during the epidemic. You mentioned Singapore. I'm familiar with the situation in Singapore, so I could explain the situation there to you. Now, I've quoted statistics from 2 international organizations. There are several dozens of countries or places that proceeded with their elections as scheduled. That included the general election in Singapore. But then the Singaporean electoral system is very different from the one in Hong Kong. As I said, we are under a lot of restrictions. Now, in Singapore, I understand the people from outside the country could vote. On the day of general election, registered Singaporean nationals could vote overseas in the embassies of Singapore. And then Singapore allows political broadcasting. That is, during the election period, free-to-air TV and radio could show political advertisements. But then for our broadcasting ordinance, it's the opposite. Even if you could afford it, you cannot place advertisements on TV and radio. And then for Singapore, in the light of the epidemic, they took extra measures. That is, they allow even more airtime at these free-to-air TV and radio stations for candidates to place election advertisements, because the candidates were not able to do other electioneering activities, of course. And also understand they made various arrangements on the polling day at various polling stations to make sure that the election could proceed. But in Hong Kong, unfortunately, we don't even have these options, because, as I said, under the existing legislation, all these measures taken by Singapore could not be done in Hong Kong. Now, this decision to postpone the election is purely based on public health considerations and on ensuring that the elections are conducted in an open and fair manner. Now, I actually only focus on looking at the development of the epidemic. I don't even have time to look at election prospects of various parties. So what we consider here now is how we could protect the safety of the millions of residents of Hong Kong. There's definitely no political consideration. You mentioned some 4 incumbent LegCo members who have been disqualified as candidates in the 2020 election. And let's say if we resume LegCo and the incumbent members shall be deemed as members, then, well, this is a hypothetical issue for the time being. I don't know what the National People's Congress will decide on now, but going by common sense, I think the most practical way is that we extend the term of the 6th Legislative Council by a year to ensure that LegCo could go back to operation, and that's in line with Section 11 of the Legislative Council Ordinance. But if that's the case, that will lead to a scenario that you mentioned. There are 4 incumbent LegCo members who've been disqualified as candidates, but then they may return to LegCo as incumbent LegCo members. Well, this is still a hypothetical situation, so we haven't actually looked into that yet. But I must say the SL government always goes by the law. So we will consider someone's qualification as a candidate. We were talking about incumbent LegCo members. There has to be a basis to make sure how the person can remain as a member. We have to see whether there is sufficient legal basis in making any decision. Thank you.
Let me supplement for clarification. In deciding whether a candidate has a valid nomination, a returning officer needs to consider the circumstances at the time of the nomination, and that is to say, at the time of nomination, whether the candidate intends to uphold the basic law and pledges allegiance to the Hong Kong SAR.